Welcome back to another video. If this is your first time here and you want to learn web development and become a better coder, start now by subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. It's time for us to discuss CSS positioning. CSS has a position property. Its values can be set to static, relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky. So what actually is CSS positioning? It's a way for us to, so to say, nudge an HTML element such as a div in any direction we want, be it top, right, bottom, or left. Note that this nudging doesn't actually remove the element from normal document flow, it just displaces it. We have an example here with 3 divs. Each div's display property is set to inline-block, so that they are all appearing next to one another, rather than on top of one another, which is, of course, the default behavior. Notice how the middle div is slightly nudged away from the top edge. That's because we're setting its position to relative, using this selector right here, div.bg2. The div.bg2 selector is like saying in plain English, hey browser, find the HTML div element that has a class attribute set to bg2 and apply the position of relative to it. So that's our HTML code, and the CSS is a little bit larger, but it's pretty easy to understand. We've got some background classes which use HTML named colors to color the background of each of these divs. The background covers the content and the padding if there is any. If there's no padding, which we can turn off using the X, we'll see the effect of the background now affecting only the content, right? And since we've already covered the box model, this should be pretty easy to grasp. So we'll still be using the capital X to turn our classes on and off. We could of course use anything else like 1, 2, 3, but for me personally, the capital X is kind of more obvious and I can understand easier what is happening in my CSS classes. So we'll stick to the capital X. Alright, so another thing that's very important here is this div selector right here. It has the position set to static and the top of 40 pixels. So the CSS position property is by default set to static, and thus we don't even have to specify it. We can think of this position static and position relative as kind of a light switch. So let's imagine that position static means that the light is off, and the position relative means that the light is on. And the browser is going into, so to say, a room, and with the position static, it's dark, and the browser can't see that the top value is set to 40 pixels. However, when the position relative is turned on, the light switch is turned on, and now the browser can see that this top is set to 40 pixels, and thus it nudges the second div right here. So let's just save our changes to see this thing being fixed again. So let's refresh, I guess. Maybe that's gonna wake it up. Okay, cool. So with the value of the position property set to relative, the top property starts working. That's the basic conclusion here. But we have one question. This is actually a pretty cool example here that we can use to describe something that is very important to understand in CSS. And that's the answer to the following question. How does the browser decide if it's going to use the position static that is set in the div selector here, or the position relative that is set in the selector below it? Because basically we are now saying to the browser to use 2 different values for the same property on the same div. With this one we're targeting a div, and with this one we're also targeting a div. So the browser resolves this conundrum with something that's called CSS specificity. Basically, CSS specificity works like this. A more specific CSS selector will take precedence over a more general CSS selector. Thus, in our current example, we have 2 CSS selectors with competing position properties, but the first CSS selector div that sets the position property to the value of static is less specific. So the second CSS selector wins because it is, of course, more specific. So this one, as we said, basically reads, hey browser, target the div that has the class of bg2. And obviously this is more specific than the selector that just reads, hey browser, target all the div elements. But we'll go back to CSS specificity in more detail in another video. Alright, so now let's turn our focus to relative positioning. Relative positioning works with top, right, bottom, and left values. It's like a switch that turns on and lets the browser see and obey our instructions on the values set in these directional properties, so to say. So basically, once the position property is set to relative, this is what happens. The element gets moved from its normal position in the document flow by the exact number of pixels we specified in the top, right, bottom, or left property, and the value here can be both negative and positive. For example, minus 40 pixels or 20 pixels. It works either way. So now that we understand this, let's close this example with just a simple change. If we change the static right here to relative, what's going to happen is all the divs are going to be nudged from their initial position by 40 pixels. But of course, we're not going to keep that change because we still need our example intact. So let's go to the second example, and here we can play around a little bit. First of all, we've got a bunch of CSS classes that are defined right here. Some of them have some funky names, but they're all pretty easy to understand. Also, I forgot to add here another class that's display inline. And this is maybe a good opportunity also to discuss the difference between the display inline and the display inline block, because in the previous videos so far we only had covered the difference between display block and display inline, but there's also kind of like a mutant property, so to say, which is inline-block, which kind of combines at first glance these two. And you might be wondering why such a complex display value, but actually it's not hard to grasp at all. Basically, the inline block allows us to set the width and a height on the element. Also, the top and bottom margins and padding are respected, but with display inline, well, it kind of works, but you can never be sure. So with display inline block, the width, the height, and the margins and paddings are always observed 100%. And to demonstrate that, we'll use this first div and we'll set its height to a new value, but we don't have a class for that right now, so let's just add another class. We'll call it h100px and we'll say height 100 pixels, and now we can save that and we're gonna add h100px. So now we have the height of 100 pixels and we can see that our div is indeed a lot taller than it was. And since we've got the DIB display inline block class and the DI display inline class, if we just remove the B letter right here, our div now becomes the display inline, and we can see that obviously the height is simply not obeyed. Browser ignores the height setting even though we've specified the proper selector, because this first div is now display inline and inline elements don't have height. Or actually we cannot change or update their height. But we can if we have a display inline block. Alright, so we have this, but we are going to turn off the height for this example because this was just a quick note to understand the difference between display and display inline block. But now we can move on to actually practicing the static and relative, or more precisely pretty much only relative positioning, because if we position our divs static, we know that they're just going to line up and now only the display is obeyed. If we turn off the display back to the default behavior, they're gonna stack on top of one another. That's all the rules that we already know. So let's undo the position static, so that way our nudging takes place. So let's replace the value to position relative, And now that we can simply start turning on and off some classes to see how they work. So here we've got T40, PX, R0, and all of the bunch of these weirdly named classes. I guess you can kind of guess what each weirdly named class does, because it's basically like a shorthand for the property value paired inside the CSS declaration. So what we're going to do here is let's use the R0 class. Let's change the R0 class on the third div right here. So R0 means set the positioning to right 0 pixels. That's our custom class name right here. But we've also got right -50. So if we change this R0 to R-50, what's going to happen is it's going to move it to the right, because it's moving it from its specific positioning -50 pixels from the right. However, if we set it to R200, it's going to move the entire div 200 pixels from the right edge. So there's 200 pixels space between the actual position in the normal document flow and the nudged position or third div. Alright, so I think that's pretty easy to understand. We can set the R back to 0, but we can also notice that it's the value relative to the right edge of the actual position of the div in the normal document flow. Now, just as a practice, we've got this example div, and we have all of these turned off right now. So if we remove the R0, we're going to see nothing is happening because of the way our code is set up. So let's try with R-50, and this time it's moved by -50 pixels from its right edge. Alright, so if we do the R-100, it's going to move even more to the right. If we use the R200, it's going to move back to the left side because it's 200 pixels away from its right edge. And similarly, if we use the R350 custom CSS class, it might even move out of the view, because 350 with this large zoom is quite a lot of space here in this case. So, but even the window size changing doesn't do anything, because we're basically moving the example div we're nudging it from this place right here, and we're nudging it 350 pixels from its right edge, and that's the space between the actual position and the nudged display position. Alright, so that's it for positioning. Feel free to play around with turning the classes on and off here, and also with maybe even changing these values to understand better how this whole thing works. And that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll discuss relative, absolute, and fixed positioning.